as you guys mentioned, you're working on developing these technologies. You're human. And as human, we all have biases. So how many of our biases make it through to the technology, to the code, to what we feed these machines? And Numa, you mentioned earlier that ChatGPT, for instance, and all these other language models are being trained by humans where they sit there and they say, yes, good, bad, right? That is, again, a human. And so not all of us think alike. We're not the same. We all have our own biases. So that seems to be a big issue, in my opinion, when it comes to AI and AI language models, is bias, and how do you eliminate it? I think part of it has to do with the fact that we all sometimes are in bubbles ourselves. So like, you know, if I think about people, for instance, in the IT industry or in the consulting world or in the financial world, you know, we tend to be around like-minded people, and sometimes that can narrow our view, our perspective of the world, and we might unintentionally hold a certain bias that we don't mean to. So how do you overcome that? Have you guys come up with any ideas?
So that's a very loaded question, right? Like as you know, like that's a question that's been asked throughout the world. It's actually very there's no easy answer to it, but like I think the main thing is we have like, everyone, like especially engineers that are developing these solutions, needs to be aware of this issue, because sometimes they are not, right? Like for example, to remove bias, now the companies, especially OpenAI, they're pushing something called alignment, right? That okay, we're gonna align the AI to a specific view so that it doesn't generate, say, hateful content or something. But when you think about it, like humans, they are not homogeneous, right? So alignment to whom, right? So when you are saying alignment, now, yesterday I saw an article that they're creating a program called super alignment, when one AI is going to help another AI to align its view. So think about it, right? Like as Ibrahim was saying, right? Like problems beget problems, right? Like bias begets bias, right? So if an AI is trying to fix another AI, it's not gonna solve the issue of bias, right? And another very interesting point you brought up is that I like, because since I work in AI applications in healthcare, you see that in healthcare the adoption is very slow. Why is that? Because when we think about healthcare applications in AI, right away alarm bells go off, right? That, oh, our health gets affected, so we have to be very careful. Like you are not gonna send out X-ray images to like unnamed people to tag that, okay, which X-ray has a lesion and which X-ray doesn't have a lesion. You are gonna use doctors for that. But when you are developing consumer applications, what they're doing is, as I said, they're hiring farms. The farms are going to other countries, right? Probably like workers with low wages that are sitting in front of a computer 14 hours a day and tagging away, right? So in an environment like that, what is the quality of the tag that we are getting, right? So this the whole AI revolution started with this data set called ImageNet, right? Like, you know how we can detect that where there's an apple here in the image, or whether there's a car in the image. That started with that data set, right? So it was, so that data set actually got the idea that, hey, we can outsource this labeling. So they used a technology called Amazon. Amazon has a technology called Mechanical Turk, where you can hire hourly paid workers to tag these images, right? So that's what they did. So they have 1 million images in ImageNet, right? And ImageNet started this kind of this deep learning AI revolution. So I think 2 years ago, there was an article about biases in the ImageNet dataset, right? So what researchers found is that because since 1 million images is tagged with like 1,000 labels, people just trained AI. They're like that, oh, we get 90% accuracy. We don't care. Like, no one actually looked at the data properly. So a researcher found out that there are labels in there that are like considered like very bad slangs, like racial slangs. And it has been perpetrated throughout all the AI algorithms that we use, right? No one bothered to actually look at the data and think about, because you get a 90% accuracy, who cares what the data, who cares who labeled the data, right? So from working in healthcare AI applications, I see that these things are treated very critically, right? Because we know that, oh, it's our health, but no one thinks about that, what can happen to your mental health when you see a slang term appearing beside your image, right? Which can happen when bias like this is perpetuated through the data set.
Oh, that's really fascinating that we're so focused on accuracy, 90%. We're at the 90%. So if we miss a few, it's okay. And those few can be very detrimental because, like, as you mentioned, you don't know how people are going to feel when they see certain things. I would even think that kind of sort of destroy brand, right? If I'm like loyal to a brand and I go on there and I see something terrible and it's meant to be related to me, I'm like, whoa, I'm not sure if you guys like me, I like you, but this doesn't feel right.
Right. And it's, so what I think Namal's example is a brilliant one, because ImageNet gets, you get algorithms that have pretty high accuracy, but there are certain parts where the algorithm fails. And it's not because that portion is a small portion in the real world. It's because that subset hasn't been covered properly in the data set. So, for instance, faces collected in ImageNet, I think over 70% of images are white North American European faces. And about 2%, I think, are from Indian faces and 1% Asian faces. So the distribution of images of faces in that data set is not representative of the population at large in the world. So while you test your algorithms on that data set and you only have, 1% of Asian faces in there, and if you get all of them wrong, you're still 99% right. But that 1% is not actually 1% of your real population. It's probably 50% of your population that you're mislabeling. The concrete example was the algorithms trained on ImageNet were put into Google Photos. And there were reports that Google Photos was mislabeling African Americans as gorillas. And so they had to pull that technology off of Google, right? Because the label data in that data set was flawed. Another example was when they used ImageNet to open your iPhone. So you could look in your camera and it'll detect your face. And there were people in China who reported that their friends could open their iPhones just because there were so few Asian faces in the data set that the system, the AI algorithm, would just assume that any Asian face was the same. And it would just open people's phones for their friends. And so they had to pull that technology out and retrain it and fix the problem. So even if you think about accuracy, it's not actual real accuracy. It's this made up accuracy on the data set that you're working with. So it creates problems. And so I want to go back to your question about what do we do with bias, right? So some of the work we've been doing in the past couple of years in my lab is biases created by search engine. I think probably everyone's seen reports that say, if you search for a nurse, you get all female nurse photos. If you search for a police officer, you get all male police officer photos back from a search engine. But what we've shown actually is it's even deeper than that. Performance on queries that are related to the female gender, for instance, have weaker results on general compared to queries that are related to male gender. So it's systematic. It's not about biases being exhibited. It's also about performance. And if you think about how people make decisions, right now, I think there's 5 billion searches done per day by people on search engines. And about over 90% of all, maybe even over 95% of access to internet goes through a search engine. So even if we know where we're going, we still search, right? And so the search engine has the possibility of showing you links the way they want you to think. So they're shaping the things you think about. You search for COVID, the links they show you actually shape what you think about COVID. You search stock market prices, whatever the search engine shows you shapes what you think about the stock market or specific parts of it. You search about, you have a 6-year-old kid, you search for educational material. Google shows you educational material that you need to, educate your kid about. That shapes the fabric of your family, because that's what you're going to show your kid, and that's how they're thinking, and so on. So technology with search is actually shaping our thoughts, our beliefs, our decisions, and so on. And when you think how these search engines actually incorporate biases, right? So think about, you search for educational material for a 5-year-old girl, you get lower quality results compared to when you search for educational material for a 5-year-old boy. And so that actually impacts how you bring up your kids and how your kids are exposed to learning opportunities and so on. So the bigger question is, how do we address these problems? And again, I think I go back to my initial stand. I don't think there is a technological solution per se to solve this. There needs to be a broader social approach to understanding biases caused by technology. So I'll give you an example and I'll make it short. So, misinformation is big, right? And, Namal can tell you that there's, every year a couple of thousand papers published on how to detect fake news with deep learning techniques, right? But a couple of years ago, some Scandinavian countries started looking at this problem and said, is there a technological solution to the misinformation problem? In other words, should we create an AI algorithm that tells Namal that you're on this website, this is fake news, don't read this? That's not the solution. The solution is you go into schools and you educate the kids right from the beginning to say, do not believe everything you read on the internet. You're on Twitter, your friends tweet things, very likely untrue. You go on Google, Google tells you this, very unlikely that it's true. You're reading news, you're on this certain news outlet, very likely fake news. So you educate, you give media literacy to your kids. So when they're exposed to content, they have these critical thinking skills that helps them make the right decisions, right? So I think it's the same thing with AI. I have this app. Is this safe? Would there be another AI technology that tells me, install this app, it's good for you? Probably not, right? I probably will need the skills to determine, before I install this app on my phone, I need to make some judgments, right? Critically think about the decision I'm making in terms of interacting with technology. And you would only be able to have that if you have the right education, right? So you need to put the educational things in place. You need to engage kids from young ages. You need a public consultation of what people think about AI, how they deal with it on a daily basis. So it's a social problem that we need to address from the roots.
Wow, you said so many great things. So I'm going to try to unpack a few because I feel like there's a lot to dive in there. First, with the whole faces debacle, I mean, that's just awful what's occurred there. But I think that goes back to the point of diversity and inclusion and why pretty much everywhere you go, there's a big push towards it. Like at my firm, we're always all about being inclusive, being diverse, because we are an IT and consulting firm. So we do help also build technology. And for us, it's important to try to address some of those issues. And the way you address it, to your point, Abraham, is not always with technology, but with people and figuring out what's going on. So if you have a more diverse workforce, they would know, okay, no, you need a bigger set of these types of faces in order to make sure that you determine things properly. So I think that's been a really good thing that has taken place in the workplace, is we are pushing for a broader view instead of just like a very narrowed lens that we've traditionally had. Now, the critical thinking portion that you mentioned, I feel like that's a really important one. And Namal and I had this conversation as well before, and that is just, learning and schooling and how important it is, because as you brought up, Abraham, like if you go online, you're constantly being driven one way or another. And there's unfortunately always a motive. It's not always a bad motive, but there's usually a motive behind why you're being driven one way or another. I didn't know that, if you were to look in search results for boys versus girls, that there was such a big discrepancy. That's quite disheartening. And hopefully it's a systematic issue that can be fixed. And I think the first step towards fixing it is to, again, have conversations about it and to bring it to light so that people are aware that this exists. And some of these issues can obviously be difficult to talk about. It can get a bit controversial, but again, you can't fix a problem if you don't shed some light on it, right? That's always, that's my approach anyway, is that if you want to fix something, you need to first address it and accept that it's there. You can't fix something if you're not going to admit that it exists. That's just not how it works. So, Nemo, I would love to bring you in here. When it comes to, we can speak about diversity, we can speak about some of the systematic issues that exist with search engines. What's your perspective? What have you seen? And do you have any solutions for us?
So, as Ibrahim was saying, the problem is that we always think about this solution from a technical point of view, and that is never going to work, right? So, the great example that Ibrahim provided for Google Photos, tagging African Americans as gorillas, you know what their solution to that problem was? They just removed it. So what they did was, now if you have human faces, it doesn't just tag it as human anymore, right? Like basically, they're like that, okay, we have a problem, let's just get rid of the thing altogether instead of trying to solve the problem, right? Trying to actually incorporate ethicists into the conversation, like social scientists into the conversation, that how do we tackle this type of diversity issues, right? I think the solution is, as I said, we're not going to have an overnight technical solution, never. Technology is never going to solve it. We just have to be aware that whenever we are using technology, there is some inherent bias in it. You have to be aware of it and think about it, that if we start the awareness from like school, as Ibrahim was saying, like I don't want to badmouth my own program, of course, but in our engineering program, we have one ethics course in 4th year, and like it also, like it's kind of a bit superficial, right? So now what we are trying to do is, in each course, we are trying to bring in a little bit of this type of conversations, right? So I teach a first year programming course. So in the first lecture, I talk a little bit about that. Okay, you are learning programming, you're going to do great things, you're going to be software engineers, you're probably going to go and work for Google, right? But think about even a line of code that you're writing, what impact it may have on society. So going back to the facial recognition problem, like why there is a bias in it, right? You can't even, it's not like people did it maliciously, right? So the first facial recognition algorithm that was developed was back in, like, based on a dataset called the Yale face dataset. So Yale back in the 70s, think about the racial diversity in Yale in 70s, probably not a lot, right? So it's not like the engineers that developed, or computer scientists that developed that facial recognition algorithm were intentionally doing it, that, oh, I'm just not gonna include any diversity. They didn't even think about it because there was no diversity around them. So as you were saying, right, this is why it's so important to be diverse in your workforce, diverse in terms of your student population when it comes to universities, and teach students to be aware of these things, that just because you are writing a program for Google, like maybe you are writing a little script that just scrapes data from the internet. As an engineer, you'll probably be thinking about that, how can I make it fast enough? You're not even going to think that, how can I make it diverse enough? So if you teach kids from school that you always have to think about these things, that how to be more inclusive, how not to trust everything, how to look at technology from a critical angle, only then we are going to come up with a holistic solution as a whole, as a society. Otherwise, it's just a technology, and another AI cannot solve this problem, right? So as much as we love doing it, right? Mm-hmm. As engineers, sometimes we get excited that, oh, I removed the bias by tweaking a parameter in the algorithm, but it's just not gonna last.
Oh, so you can't just keep compounding AI on top of each other until the problem gets solved.